If an avoidant does this, they're never coming back. Let's talk about something difficult but important. You've been involved with someone who pulls away. Hot and cold, in, then out. You've told yourself they're just scared. They just need time. Maybe if I show them I'm safe, they'll open up. But here's the truth. There's a difference between someone needing space and someone using distance to escape emotional responsibility. Avoidant behavior doesn't always mean they're bad people. Sometimes it comes from fear, past trauma, or conditioning. But you deserve to be loved out loud, not in silence or absence. Now, here's the turning point you need to understand. If someone with an avoidant attachment actively rewrites the story to make you the reason for their detachment, they're not coming back. Because that's not avoidance rooted in fear. That's avoidance rooted in justification. And when someone finds a reason to blame you for needing intimacy, when they say, you were too much, or I felt pressure just because you wanted clarity or commitment, they're not struggling with connection, they're running from accountability. That kind of avoidance isn't waiting to heal and return, they're rewriting history to excuse their exit. And here's what I want you to remember. If you have to shrink yourself to keep someone comfortable, they're not your person. If you have to abandon your needs just to be tolerated, you're not in a relationship. You're in emotional exile. Real love doesn't punish you for needing closeness. It doesn't vanish the moment you ask to be chosen. Let them go. Because someone who's capable of emotionally ghosting you and then blaming you for their silence isn't preparing to come back. They're preparing to forget. And you're preparing to rise. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away, it can be painful and confusing. At first, it might seem like they just need space. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe intimacy feels a bit too much too soon. You might tell yourself that if you give them time, if you stay patient and show them they're safe with you, they'll come around. But there's a turning point that often gets missed when their withdrawal stops being about them and starts being blamed on you. That's when the shift happens. If an avoidant starts to justify their emotional distancing by reframing the relationship as your fault, by claiming that your need for closeness was too much, that you were too needy, too intense, or that you pressured them, they're not just creating space for healing or reflection. They're constructing a narrative that allows them to walk away without guilt. And when someone uses blame to justify their escape, it becomes far less likely that they're ever planning to come back. This isn't about healthy boundaries or honest communication. This is about rewriting history to make themselves feel better about leaving. They take your natural desire for intimacy and mutual care, things that are entirely normal in a relationship, and distort them into flaws. This reframing isn't just a self-protective mechanism, it becomes a tool for avoidance. It helps them say to themselves, I had no choice but to leave, when in reality, they simply weren't ready or willing to show up in the way you deserved. The danger here is not just the end of the relationship, but what it does to you. You may start questioning your instincts. You might replay conversations, analyze your texts, wonder if you were, in fact, too much. This internal erosion is what keeps many people stuck long after the avoidant has gone. And ironically, the more you try to prove that you're not too much, that you're understanding, accommodating, low pressure, the more you erase yourself to become palatable to someone who was never capable of meeting you in the first place. Once someone has reached the point of justifying their departure by framing your desire for connection as a flaw, they are not only avoiding intimacy, they are avoiding responsibility. And people who avoid responsibility don't return seeking resolution. They return, if at all, only when their need outweighs their fear again. But they don't come back with new insight or readiness to commit. They come back for comfort, not commitment. The hard truth is this: when avoidance turns into blame, it's no longer a temporary state, it's a decision. A quiet exit wrapped in a narrative that lets them believe they were right to leave. And unless something drastically shifts in their emotional maturity and self-awareness, they're not coming back. Not to reconnect, not to repair, and certainly not to take accountability. Not all avoidant behavior is temporary. This is one of the hardest truths to accept when you care deeply about someone who keeps pulling away. In the beginning, you may see their distance as something that will pass, a momentary reaction to stress, fear, or emotional overwhelm. You assume that if you can just hold space for them, if you're patient and kind enough, they'll come back around. But what often goes unspoken is that avoidance doesn't always come with a return trip. Sometimes it's a permanent exit masked as a pause. Avoidant individuals often struggle to tolerate emotional closeness. They may crave connection in theory, but when it begins to take shape in real life, when it requires vulnerability, communication, and showing up consistently, they begin to feel suffocated. That suffocation isn't always caused by the relationship or by you, is triggered by their own unresolved fears. But instead of confronting those fears, many avoidants retreat. It's a protective mechanism. The problem is that in many cases, they don't just retreat to process their emotions, they retreat because they are fundamentally uncomfortable with the emotional labor that intimacy requires. What makes this particularly painful for the person on the receiving end is the hope. You hold on to the idea that they'll come back when they've calmed down, when they've had time to think. But for some avoidants, space isn't about reflection, it's about escape. And if avoidance becomes their default mode of dealing with conflict or emotional demand, then what you're experiencing is not a temporary disconnection, but a pattern that can repeat over and over, or end abruptly when the discomfort becomes too great. In many cases, avoidants don't see their behavior as a problem. They feel justified in pulling away because they interpret intimacy as pressure. So rather than address the internal conflict between wanting closeness and fearing it, they externalize the issue. They may withdraw without warning, avoid tough conversations, or act as if the relationship never really mattered to them at all. They minimize, dismiss, or outright ignore the emotional investment you shared. And that's when the distance stops being a pause and starts becoming a silent ending. Waiting for an avoidant to return after they've emotionally disengaged can feel like waiting for a door to open that was never locked, but was slowly closed and bolted from the inside. You hope they'll work through their avoidance and return more available, more open, but unless they're actively working to understand and heal their attachment style, that return may never come. It's not that they're incapable of love, it's that they may not be ready or willing to love in a way that includes consistency, vulnerability, and emotional safety. That's the risk of staying in limbo with someone who avoids instead of engages. You mistake absence for healing when sometimes it's simply avoidance, becoming a new, permanent normal. Not every silent space is a space for growth. Some are quiet goodbyes in disguise. Some real connection doesn't punish emotional honesty. In a healthy relationship, expressing your needs, your fears, and your desires is not only allowed, it's necessary. Vulnerability is the bridge to intimacy. When someone cares about you, when they're emotionally available and capable of building a secure connection, they won't make you feel guilty for wanting closeness. They won't treat your emotional honesty as a problem to be fixed or a pressure they need to escape. But with someone who leans into avoidant behavior, this is often exactly what happens. At first, things might seem perfect. Avoidants often show up strong in the early stages of a relationship. They can be charming, attentive, and even enthusiastic about spending time with you. But as emotional intimacy deepens, when things start to feel real, they begin to pull back. And often, the moment you bring up how that feels, the moment you express a need for clarity or ask for more emotional presence, the dynamic shifts. Suddenly, you're too intense. You're moving too fast. You're making things complicated. But all you're really doing is telling the truth. You're saying, I need to feel emotionally connected, or I want to understand where we're going. That's not pressure, that's partnership. And someone who is capable of real emotional connection won't punish you for being honest about those needs. They might not always know exactly how to meet them right away, but they'll want to understand you. They'll stay in the conversation. They won't make you feel like your emotions are the reason things are falling apart. With avoidant partners, though, the script often flips. Your honesty becomes the threat. The relationship suddenly becomes too heavy, too demanding, too overwhelming, not because your needs are excessive, but because the avoidant has not built the emotional muscles to carry any weight outside of their own. And so they retreat. They use your vulnerability as the justification for distance instead of engaging with it as a chance to grow closer. This creates a damaging dynamic where you're constantly second-guessing yourself. You start editing your emotions, suppressing your needs, tiptoeing around conversations that should be safe to have. You convince yourself that if you just say less, ask for less, feel less, they might stay. But what kind of relationship are you left with when emotional truth becomes a risk? When asking for reassurance is treated like a flaw? Real connection welcomes honesty. It creates room for uncomfortable conversations, not as a threat, but as a path to deeper trust. It doesn't shut down when things get real. It leans in. A person who's ready to love you will see your emotional honesty as a gift, not a burden. They won't vanish when you speak your truth. They'll meet you in it, even if they don't always know exactly what to say or do. Because real love, real connection, is built not in the performance of perfection, but in the willingness to stay present when things get vulnerable. Letting go isn't always about losing someone. It's about reclaiming yourself from a situation that was quietly diminishing you. When you're attached to someone who consistently avoids emotional depth, who sidesteps accountability and disappears when intimacy calls for effort, you start carrying the weight of the entire relationship on your own. You begin explaining away their absence, justifying their inconsistency, and bending yourself into someone smaller just to keep the peace. But here's the truth. Holding on to someone who refuses to grow doesn't keep the love alive. It keeps you stuck. It's incredibly difficult to walk away from someone you believe has potential. You remember the good moments, the chemistry, the laughter. You may even feel certain that beneath their emotional walls, there's a loving, kind version of them that could come forward. If only. If only you were more patient. If only they felt safer. If only the timing were right. But if only is a dangerous loop that keeps you anchored to hope instead of reality. And reality is this: potential isn't enough to build a life with. Consistency, effort, and growth are. When someone refuses to examine their patterns, when they keep defaulting to avoidance rather than choosing courage and vulnerability, they're not just pausing the relationship, they're pausing their own evolution. And as long as you're waiting on someone who's unwilling to grow, you're being pulled away from your own. You're sacrificing your emotional clarity for a relationship built on ambiguity. You're offering love where there's no container to hold it. The thing about growth is that it's uncomfortable. It demands that a person take responsibility for how they show up in relationships, that they acknowledge the impact of their silence, their withdrawal, their emotional evasiveness. Not everyone is ready or willing to do that work. And you can't force someone to grow. You can't love someone into maturity. That's a journey they have to choose for themselves. Staying with someone who avoids rather than engages might feel like love, but over time, it turns into self-abandonment. You stop voicing your needs because you don't want to scare them away. You stop asking for clarity because you fear it will push them further. And slowly, you become a quieter, softer, more anxious version of yourself. Not because that's who you are, but because that's who you have to become to be tolerated by someone who can't hold space for the real you. Letting go feels like loss at first. It feels like surrendering the dream of what could have been. But what you're actually releasing is the illusion that love can survive on one-sided effort, that someone will change just because you love them enough. True partnership takes two emotionally available people who are willing to meet each other in the middle. And if someone is refusing to do the emotional work required for growth, clinging to them only keeps you in a relationship with their limitations, not their love. You don't need to be less to be loved. That may seem simple, even obvious, but when you've been in a relationship with someone who consistently withdraws, shuts down, or makes you feel like your emotional needs are too much, this truth can start to slip away. Over time, you might begin to believe that the problem isn't the lack of reciprocity or effort on their part, it's you. That if you could just dial yourself down a bit, shrink your expectations, stay quiet when you're hurt, or become more low maintenance, they might finally stay. This is one of the most damaging beliefs that can take root in a connection with an avoidant partner. You begin molding yourself into what you think they can handle. You stop initiating important conversations because they don't like drama. You hesitate to ask for reassurance because they need space. You convince yourself that their detachment is normal and your desire for closeness is the issue. But let's be clear, needing consistency, emotional availability, and communication in a relationship is not needy. It's not demanding, it's human. When someone makes you feel like your emotional needs are a burden, it's not a sign that you're too much. It's a sign that they're not equipped to meet you where you are. And instead of being honest about their own limitations, they deflect the responsibility onto you. This can be subtle. They may not say outright, "You're too much," but they'll show it in how they disengage when conversations get real, in how they ghost you after emotional intimacy, or in how they make you feel guilty for expressing vulnerability. What happens next is heartbreaking. You begin to disappear from your own life. You stop showing up fully, even with yourself. You silence your voice, your instincts, and your boundaries, all in the hope that this version of you, this more acceptable version, will finally be enough to keep them close. But no relationship is worth trading in your wholeness. And the truth is, the more you abandon parts of yourself to hold on to someone, the further you get from the kind of love you actually deserve. Healthy love doesn't ask you to become invisible. It doesn't ask you to suppress your truth to make someone else feel more comfortable. In fact, real love requires that you be fully yourself. It thrives when both people show up honestly, even imperfectly, and are met with empathy, not punishment. The right person will never ask you to be smaller, just to stay. They won't run from your depth. They'll lean into it. Your sensitivity, your honesty, your emotional presence, these are not flaws. They are strengths. And anyone who makes you feel like you need to dim your light to be loved isn't offering love. They're offering conditional acceptance. The kind that depends on your silence, not your soul. And that's not the kind of love you're here for. Thank you for listening and for giving yourself the space to understand these truths. Remember, the most important relationship you will ever have is the one with yourself. So honor your heart, stand in your worth, and never settle for anything less than what makes you feel alive. Take care, be kind to yourself, and keep believing in the love you deserve. Thank you.